Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is Felix Rodriguez. He is a U.S. Army veteran who served in the Vietnam War and also with the CIA. And he was instrumental in the capture of Cuban revolutionary Che Guevara. And Felix, thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure with all of you.
Where were you born and raised, sir?
I was from Cuba, in a small town called Santi Espiritus. I was raised there until about 10 years old, and I went to Havana for a couple of years, and then I came to school in the United States from 1954 to 1960 at Perkiomen Prep in Pennsburg, Pennsylvania.
So it's while you were there that the Castro revolution took place in Cuba. I know that a lot of people weren't great fans of the previous regime. What were your thoughts of Batista and then Castro, and how soon did you realize that Castro was bad news for Cuba?
Well, my family was on the Batista side. My uncle was Secretary of Public Works during that time. Of course, we heard a lot of him being communist and what communism signified. So I was one of the ones that really wasn't enthusiastic at all about Fidel Castro, and it proved to be true.
And how soon did you start to hear about what he promised in the revolution was not what was happening in Cuba?
Well, in 1958, when he took over at the end, he took over in January 1959, the first thing that he started doing is the firing squad. I was in school, I was looking at the execution taking place in Cuba, especially one that really touched me. It was a Cuban mayor, Sosa Blanco. He was like a Roman circus. He was surrounded by people yelling at him. They brought a witness, and the witness started pointing at the prosecutor, saying, "You killed my brother." And they had to tell him, no, it was the guy next to the prosecutor. It was just a joke to our system. And the guy was executed. Later on, they found out that his brother actually was in Miami. He was not even executed by Mayor Sosa Blanco. So I felt something had to be done. So when I went to visit my parents in Mexico, actually we waited for New Year's Eve in Mexico, 58, 59. That's when Fidel took over. I came back again on vacations. There was a recruiting individual who was recruiting Cuban for the first operation against Castro, who took place in the Dominican Republic in 1959. So I decided to join that. My father would not sign the paper because I was too young. I was 17. So I forfeited his signature in front of him, and he agreed, but he would not sign it. Actually, on the 4th of July of 1959, I got into the Dominican Republic. The operation unfortunately failed. I had to come back to the United States. Again, I graduated from high school. Then I was accepted at the University of Miami. When I came to Miami, I learned there was something else going on someplace against Castro, and I joined what later became the Bay of Pig invasion.
It started off as an assassination plot, correct?
Well, while I was under training, we trained Guatemala first. Then we were taken to Panama for additional training. So when we were in training in Panama, I went with a friend of mine named Segundo Borges to see the American from the CIA who was in charge of that operation. And we volunteered to eliminate Castro physically. We felt if that was going to take place, it would shorten the war in Cuba, it would save a lot of lives. So we weren't told anything at the time. We came to Miami, and then we were told that the operation was approved. So they gave us a rifle with telescopic sight. I guess it was a German rifle, a very powerful one. 20 rounds of ammunition, you need 2 or 3 only. And it told me it was already pre-sighted. I didn't have to touch the sight because it was already pre-sighted at the distance. They thought I was going to be shooting Castro. So they gave us a luxurious yacht, a boat, white with air conditioning. It was a Ukrainian, Romanian crew and 1 American captain. And twice we got to the Cuban coastline, and really nobody was waiting for us. We had to return. On the 3rd attempt to infiltrate Cuba for that operation, the engine broke. We came back, and then somehow they terminated the operation. They took the rifle away from me, added 2 more men to my team, and then I entered Cuba as being a Special Forces of the Brigade at the end of February 1961. And later we learned that the boat did belong to Sergeant Schreifer, a relative of President Kennedy. It was only used for that operation.
Tell us more about the Bay of Pigs and what went wrong and how you got out.
Well, actually, a lot of people question why the operation was entrusted to the CIA instead of the Pentagon, being a landing operation, where the CIA had no expertise. And the simple answer is it was never meant to be an invasion, per se, the way it did happen. The Eisenhower administration learned in the early 60s, through the intelligence service and the CIA, that the relation between Cuba and the Soviet Union was shifting to a point that they were planning to bring offensive missiles into the island. And so President Eisenhower entrusted the CIA with an operation to destabilize the Castro regime. And the original concept was not an invasion. It was actually to support the existing guerrillas in the Escambray, bring people in there, and once they have a stronger guerrilla that Fidel could not come into an area, they will bring the rest of the brigade with a provisional government, a powerful radio station, and give the news to the world that there was a provisional government in there promising free election within a year. And that would meant at the end of Castro, the Organization of American States was going to support it. And of course, it will be like 95 or more % of American troops and a little bit of Latin American troops. That will be the end of it. That was the concept of the operation. Nevertheless, that really, when the election took place, President Kennedy was elected. When he was faced with the operation itself, he decided to continue the operation, but he didn't want to go with a Republican plan. So he terminated the original plan that was conceived by the CIA, and then he developed his own plan. His first option was to take the city of Trinidad. It was a good option. Nevertheless, at the 1st of April, actually, his advisor ill-advised him that it would be very difficult to deny the American participation in the operation because it was a big city, or a small city, but there would be a lot of press in there. And then they decided to terminate that operation and get a secluded area like the Bay of Pigs to land the operation in there. But for us to be successful in that area, we had to control the air. And unfortunately, that didn't happen because of political situations again. Our first airstrike that took place 2 or 3 days before the invasion, they completely eliminated 90% of Castro's Air Force. The remaining 10% was going to be eliminated on the final airstrike of 16 of our B-26's plane. Nevertheless, that didn't come through because at that time they already have shot down one of our B-26s, which is a little bit different from the Cuban B-26 that they had. They have a different type of nomenclature. Our had the .850 caliber in the nose, what the Cuban had on the wings. When they shot that one down, the U.S. ambassador, Adlai Stevenson, were telling the world that these were defecting planes from the Castro's Air Force. And then Raul Roa, the ambassador for Cuba, showed the picture that they were not invading, that they was actually from the United States, that the Cuban place was completely different to the one that they shot down. And then Adlai Stevenson told his administration, unless they put a stop to the airstrike, he will resign to the UN. And in a point of crisis, it will be very difficult to have the U.S. ambassador to resign. So they stopped the airstrike to convince Adlai Stevenson to stay, and that was enough for Castro's Air Force to completely sink our boat that was carrying all the ammunition, all the rockets, fuel for the planes and everything, and it was not a contingency plan. So when the boat was sank, our brigade fought bravely for 72 hours with the ammunition that was only supposed to be for the first 24 hours. And when they ran out of ammunition, they didn't surrender, but they had to go into the swamp and try to survive. And that's what we call today the fiasco of the Bay of Pigs.
How did you get out?
Well, I did infiltrate Cuba finally in the end of last part of February. I started working with the Cuban resistance inside until the 17th of April when it was, a big fiasco. What Castro did very intelligently was to surround every single house and block in Havana, especially the main cities. And if you were a male and you were not part of the regime, even though you have done nothing, or they have no record of you being against the regime, they will pick you up and put you in a temporary concentration camp. There were baseball fields in Havana with high fences with 150,000 Cubans in it. A theater like the Blanquita that they call now the Karl Marx, who had the capacity for 5,000, had 5,500 people in there. And he was able to completely disarticulate the internal resistance, who was very, very effective at the time. I was lucky that I was able to make it to the house of a diplomat, a Spanish diplomat, because the lady from the resistance who was driving me around knew him. And he arrived to the home where we were, apartment building where we were, just before the militia got there. And then they told me I had to go to an embassy because they could not keep me in that place for a long time. So I finally got political asylum in the Venezuelan embassy, where I spent the next 6 months before they gave me a safe conduct. So on the 13th of September of 1961, I took a plane with another 100 and some Cubans to Caracas, Venezuela, spent about a week in there, came back to the United States on the 1st of October, and before the end of October was over, I was back inside Cuba, but with an intelligence type of operation, going back and forcing a boat to the Cuban coastline.
Now, by then, did you know who Che Guevara was?
Oh, everyone knew who he was, but he was not, the important individual like it is. Like I tell people when they talk to me about Che Guevara, at the time, what did you feel? The guy is another guerrilla, and by the way, he was a terrible guerrilla. So he wasn't, you didn't have the perception of who he was really at the time, because he was nobody at the time, even though we knew that he was with Fidel Castro.
When did you join the army?
Well, after the Bay of Pig invasion was a failure, the president did everything possible to bring the brigade out. And then at the end of December of 1962, he met with the brigade. It was finally actually ransomed out of Cuba at the Orange Bowl. And there he was given a flag of the brigade that allegedly was in Cuba with us, and the president promised that he will soon return that flag in free Havana. And personally, I really believe that he did manage to do that. And what he did was, immediately after that, he opened the Armed Forces of the United States for the brigade officer. So there were about 212 of us who joined the United States Army under a presidential commission in 1963. Actually, we went through the recruitment center in February of 1963, and then we went to Fort Benning, Georgia, in different uniform. You could select whatever branch you wanted, so I selected Army. So there were people in the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine at Fort Benning taking the basic training. Actually, what they gave us was the OCS, the Officer Candidate School Training. But they couldn't call it that because we were already second lieutenant. So they used the same training block, and they call it SOTP, Special Officer Training Program. So we went through Fort Benning during that training. Unfortunately, later on, the president was assassinated. And I say unfortunately because I honestly believe that if he had not assassinated, Fidel would not have been there. Because really? He has a firm commitment to eliminate, and also Bobby Kennedy. And for example, at the end of our training, I was visited by Dr. Artima, the head of the brigade, and he asked me to resign my commission to go with him to Central America. And his words were, this time we are going to control the operation. Everybody knew that during the Bay of Pigs, every decision was taken by American advisor. And of course, you remember the time was that type of thinking that John Wayne never lose. U.S. had never lost a war. So we never questioned anything that was told us to do. So after the fiasco this time, we were told that we were going to control the operation. We were going to have everything that we needed. So I recall I asked Dr. Artima, say, Manolo, what guarantee do I have that the president is behind this, really? He said, well, what do you need? I said, well, you want me to resign my commission in the Army and go with you to get a special training in communication, to be your head of communication. Give me this training in uniform here in Fort Benning. And if they do that, the president is behind that, then I'll resign and go with you. So he told me, go and talk to your supervisor and tell him you want to go move to a special communication training. So here I go and see Major Angel Torres, who was a Puerto Rican in charge of our training. I presented myself, Lieutenant Rodriguez. I said, sir, I'd like to change to a special communication training. And his answer was, well, Lieutenant, first of all, there is no such thing as special communication training. Second, if it were, it's too late. You have to go to Fort Howard in Virginia for intelligence training. And third, who told you? I said, well, I cannot tell you. Of course, he threw me out of his office. So we graduated from that basic course. We went to Miami, and about a week later, I got a call from Aurora Street, this recruiting center. Lieutenant Rodriguez called immediately Major Torres. So I called Major Torres in Fort Benning, and his words were, Lieutenant, come immediately to Fort Benning. We have here Mr. Moose and Mr. Flanagan to give you your special communication training. So we went back to Fort Benning. They gave us a building inside the base that was abandoned. They had we had a sergeant to translate it because there were three of us. I selected to go with me, and the other two didn't speak any English. So, and then it was a Puerto Rican sergeant, and his last name happened to be Castro, of all the names. And, we went through the training. We finally finished the training there. We resigned our commission in the Army, and we joined him for a special operation in Central America. We had bases in Nicaragua and Costa Rica, and then the president was assassinated. Of course, that continued because of respect to the old president, but that was not the priorities of President Johnson. Later on, our people in the Army were told that the promise of the president died with the president. If they wanted to make a career, fine. If not, you want to leave, go ahead and do it, because there is no longer a commitment by the government to liberate Cuba. So, after that, I continued to work with the CIA in different operations.
Well, let's talk about the one you're probably most famous for, tracking, capturing, and interrogating Che Guevara. First of all, how did you know he was in Bolivia? And then explain the plot and the plan to capture him.
Well, it was a strong belief at the agency at that time that Che had been killing Africa. Because in 1964, he went to Africa, to the Congo Belga, and he was operating the Tanganyika River in that area where we had a couple of boats from the Artemia operation in there. We had a lot of Cuban operating with the Macasi operation from the CIA. And there was an incident where they were able to sink about 4 boats that were carrying weapons with rebels, and they felt that he was there. He happened to escape in the other 2 boats and never surfaced anywhere in the world. So people believe, and the station chief in there believed that he was killed. Now, when the guerrilla surfaced in Bolivia, there was 2 foreigners who visited him. One was Regis Debray, who was a French intellectual who later became advisor to President Mitterrand for foreign policy. And the other one was Ciro Busso, an Argentinian newspaper guy. When they were leaving the guerrilla, they were captured. And in their debriefing and interrogation of them, they were the one who confirmed that indeed Che Guevara was there. With this information, and because of the poor training of the Bolivian armed forces, the U.S. government immediately sent a special forces unit from Panama to train the 2nd Ranger Battalion in counterinsurgency. It was commanded by Major Pappy Shelton, Ralph Shelton from Tennessee, who became a close friend of mine. And then they selected a few Cubans to be the advisor in intelligence to the battalion and to the Ministry of Interior. And the reason actually that they selected us was because there was a prohibition from Ambassador Henderson that no U.S. citizen could participate in area of danger or combat. And the reason why Vietnam was already taking place, there were a lot of people being killed already, advisors from the Vietnam era. They didn't want to have Americans being killed in Central and South America. Because we were Cubans, so we were no citizens, there was no problem killing us. It would be no big deal then. That's why they selected us to go there. So there were 2 of us that were selected to go to Bolivia to advise the 2nd Ranger Battalion at the 8th Division headquarters. And I'll tell you, it was interesting because later on I asked this guy who selected me, Larry Sternfield, why he selected me, because there were 16 people he interviewed. And he told me the last thing you told me. And what happened is after the interview, he will tell you, if I select you, when will you be ready to be mobilized? And everybody would say in a week or whatever time they needed. My answer to him was, he said, if I have time, I'll take my car, I go to my home, I say goodbye to my wife, to my 2 kids, I'll come back, and we go. If we don't have time, you give me the phone here, I'll call my wife and tell Rosa I have to go. If we don't have time for that, then let's go, I'll give you her number, you call her and tell her that I have to go. I guess nobody tell him that, that's why he selected me to go there. So that's how I ended up going to Bolivia as a second advisor to the 2nd Ranger Battalion, and especially to the 8th Division headquarters where Che Guevara was operating.
How'd you find him?
Well, it was a process of months. Nobody knew exactly where he was. The guy was completely without communication. Fidel Castro sent him to be killed in there because Che Guevara was pro-Chinese and Cuba depended solely on the Soviet Union. So there was no interest of the Cuban for him to be successful because of the Soviet Union pressure on them. And the proof are that when he was sent down there, his transmitter that was given to him was broken, so he could not communicate back to Cuba. Then Mario Monge, the head of the Communist Party, who had the dinner with him on the 31st of December of 1966 at committee, that's when they came in complete brokerage. They completely separated from each other. Mario Monge had been 2 months before that with Fidel Castro in Havana. And after that, he told even the members of the Communist Party who had joined Che that if they stayed with him, they would be fired, they would be expelled from the Communist Party. So they didn't get any support from the Communist Party at all. And then a Cuban intelligence officer, Renan Montero, who was in La Paz, who had been very well in place in the area to the point that he had been even invited to President Barrientos' party at the presidential palace. Once Che and all 17 of them arrived in Bolivia, he was called back to Cuba with the pretext that his visa had expired. And the guy had the Bolivian citizenship, so he was definitely sent there to be killed. During the period of the operation in there, we had a lot of information that we were aware because of the debriefing of Debray and Busso that I read in Washington. There was one specific guerrilla by the name of Paco, Jose Castillo Chavez, who showed up in the interviews that the guy wanted to leave the guerrilla. He was a communist, but he was lied upon. He was never told really that he was going to be a guerrilla. They told him he was going to go to visit Cuba and the Soviet Union. And when he arrived in this place where he thought they were going to be given documentation to fly in a small plane to Uruguay for that, then he found out that he wasn't a guerrilla. And he told them that he was a communist, he supported them, but he didn't want to be in the guerrilla. So we knew that he had that type of situation. So 2 months before Che was captured, there was an encounter in a place called Vado del Yeso. And there was a campesino that had helped them before by the name of Honorato Rojas. And this campesino is the Rio Grande. When they have to move from one place to the other, is at the time of the raining season, it's very difficult, dangerous to cross. And the guerrilla even lost people trying to cross the river by themselves. So Honorato have helped the guerrilla in the past. And this was a group commanded by Juan Vitalio Acuña Núñez, a Cuban mayor, who went out on his exploration separate from Che's group. And he went to Honorato for help. Now, Honorato have been told by the army, if you help them the second time, you will have problem with us. And there was a military unit who was close by. When the guys went to see Honorato, he told the guerrilla, wait here, I'm going to find out, where is the best place to cut. And then he went to this unit commanded by Captain Mario Vargas. And Mario Vargas was told then by this farmer that he had this group of guerrilla wanted to cross the river, though they selected Vado del Yeso. It's an area which is very easy to cross with some rocks in between. So he brought the whole guerrilla into that area, told them where to cross. Now, by that time, Captain Vargas had already people displaced on both sides of the river. So they start crossing. The first one was a Cuban lieutenant by the name of Reyes, Eliseo Reyes. And he spotted one soldier on the other side by the last name of Vaca. That's the only loss of the army. He killed Soldier Vaca. Fire was from both sides of the river. Every one of them were killed except 3. One called El Negro, who the river took him and finally was killed on the other side, on the other division. And they were captured 2 of them, Paco, José Castillo Chávez, and Ernesto Maimura. Now, that evening we were told that Ernesto Maimura became kind of arrogant with the army. He was shot on the spot. And Paco was brought to Valle Grande. So while I was in Santa Cruz, the head of intelligence, Major Arnaldo Saucedo, came to me and said, Mi Capitan, we have information, we have a guerrilla alive, let's go interrogate him. So we flew in a Bolivian C-46 aircraft, military plane to Valle Grande. We got into the room, they had him on a hospital called Nuestro Señor de Malta. And it was pathetic to look at that view in there. This guy was sitting in there. He was afraid like hell and had like 15 soldiers pointing their rifle at his head. I mean, the guy could not go anywhere. So I talked to him briefly, and the guy had a tremendous memory. He will be able to recite to you a meeting that took place 6 months ago, the name of the place, the address, and the name of 16 people. So definitely it was of our interest to keep him alive. So I told him, the mayor, let's go and get him released to us. So when we arrived at the commanding headquarters there, it was a General David Lafuente, was the head of the army, and he was being told at that time by a colonel, we already interrogated this guy, he knows nothing of importance, give us the word. We already told the press that he was badly wounded. He had 2 bullets through here, but they were not fatal. And then I asked him for him. And I have to go very strongly with the general. Now, the general had met me before in a barbecue that we had with General Potter, the 4-star U.S. general. And he knew that I had a ID card from the president and from the commander-in-chief to give me all the support that I requested. So he told this colonel to turn this over, this soldier guerrilla to me. Now, they objected that the plane where I was going to go, there was going to be a lot of press aboard the plane. So at that point in time, I told them, I said, look, the plane that we came in have a closed cabin for the pilot. So we bring the prisoner in, we close him in there, and then you can bring the press on board. So they agree on that. So I went with the mayor to pick up the prisoners. We did. Now, when we arrived to the plane, they already had the press inside the plane. And they had a major that fortunately was not in the meeting. And, of course, they sent him purposely to tell us, oh, the press is there, so we have to take him by road. You mean what that exactly mean? If they're going to take him by road, it will be that he will try to escape and they will kill him. Now, since he was not in the meeting, I didn't even look at him that much to the mayor. I said, look, we have order from General Lafuente to bring this guy to Santa Cruz. Give me your jacket. I put it over the head of the prisoner who had, long hair. And I walked him through all the press into the front cabin and brought him to Santa Cruz. Of course, the next day they was in the newspaper because they could see he had no uniform, he had no boots and everything. But at least we had him. And he was instrumental in giving us all the detail of how Che was moving around. When Che moved from point A to point B, he will have what he called the vanguard, 1 kilometer in front of him, with about 5 guerrillas. He will be in the center with the majority of the guerrilla, and then 1 kilometer behind, he had the rear car with another 5 or 6 guerrilla. And Paco gave us the names that he remembered, the pseudonym that all of those people had. So in late September of 1961, there was an encounter for the regular army commanded by Lieutenant Eduardo Galindo Garteche and we were reported that he had an encounter with the guerrilla. He was bringing back to the area of Pucara 3 dead bodies. So with this information, I moved in there in a jeep with a friend of mine and the head of intelligence. We waited for lieutenant to arrive. He arrived with the 3 dead bodies, over 3 mules. One of them was Coco Peredo, the leader of the Bolivian guerrilla. The other one was Mario Gutierrez Ardaya, who was a doctor, a medical doctor from the guerrilla. And the other one was Miguel, who we understood was a Cuban captain. Later, his name was Capitan Hernandez Osorio, Manuel Hernandez Osorio from the Cuban army. And we knew that they were part of the vanguard of Che. So with this information, I went to see Colonel Centeno Anaya, the commander of the division. I told him, Colonel, Che is in the area. We need to move the battalion. Who basically the basic training was already finished, but they still needed like 2 weeks for graduation, which meant they were going. The president was going to go there, issue a diploma to them for graduation. He was going to get, whoever got the best shooting get a medal of this thing. So the colonel told me, say, look, Felix, it's only 2 weeks for basic training to be finished, all the ceremony. I said, my colonel, in 2 weeks we'll have no idea where Che is. We know where he is right now. And I explained to him what Paco told us and exactly what Galindo told me, which coincided that it has to be Che. So with this, he decided to cut the training short. They moved the battalion into the operational area. I moved with them in a jeep. There were 4 companies of less than 200 men each. One stayed in Valle Grande to maintain communication and support of the battalion. One company commanded by Captain Raul Lopez Leighton was put along the Rio Grande so they could not move to the other side. Even though our unit could operate anywhere in the country, these people have been very close to the 8th Division. They didn't want to go to the 4th Division, which was the other side of the Rio Grande. Then another company commanded by Captain Celso Torrelio stayed in Higueras at the last point where Che had been seen to support the company was doing the search. It was commanded by Captain Gary Prado. So they actually deployed on the 1st of October into the operational area. We had trained some intelligence unit for them, some soldiers who spoke the Quechua, the Aymara, and the other dialect from Paraguay. And this unit moved ahead of the company to look and talk to the farmers. It was on a weekend, and I had found out that we did have 3 aircraft, Bolivian ground-to-air support wasn't possible because they didn't have any communication. Their aircraft had operating frequency of VHF, and the troops operating with FM 50-some megahertz. So I borrowed 3 PRC-10 radios from the Army and installed one in every one of the aircraft, so they will be able to support from the air the troops in the ground. It was a Sunday. It was 11 o'clock in the morning when the mayor came and said, mi capitán, we have information from the operational area, the Papá Cansado. That is tired. It was a simple code that said that it was the head of the guerrilla was captured and he was alive, wounded. Now, they didn't know whether it was Che or was Inti Peredo, the brother of Coco, who was the head of the guerrilla at that time on the Bolivian side. So I was able to fly in the back of one aircraft, Major Serrate, the head of operation, the back of the other one, and then we were told over the radio that it was the foreigner, so it was Che. So when I came back, I passed this information to Colonel Centeno. He immediately dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Andres Celich in a helicopter to be dropped in the operational area to gather all the documentation from Che to make sure that they didn't take it like souvenir and try to interrogate him. And the helicopter pilot flew back. Then that night we had a reception at the hotel. I got a couple of bottles I had bought before, either Teacher or Valentine, to celebrate when something like this happened. This seems more than appropriate. So I opened the 2 bottles of scotch. We all drank. I remember the colonel saying, was this the end of capture of Che Guevara? And now it will be peace in my country, in Bolivia. And I asked him if I could accompany him on the following day. As you can imagine, everybody wanted to go. There was a lieutenant colonel, deputy commander of the battalion. The others were majors. Nevertheless, did develop a great relationship with all of them. So when the colonel asked if I could accompany him, that he knew how much harm Che had done to my country, they all agreed. So on the following day, I am a radio operator, so I did prepare a message for Washington. I sent a message saying, Che Guevara was captured, he was alive, and if they wanted to keep him alive, that they have told me, they better move very strongly in La Paz, because these people weren't keeping any prisoner. And then I had another contact on the following day by telegraph radio. So that night, I will be honest with you, I hardly slept that night thinking about this. I was like 5 o'clock in the morning, I was up at 6:30, I was in the wrong way waiting for the colonel, and we flew in the helicopter, the pilot and the 2 of us. When we landed actually in the area of La Higueras, where Che was, we landed right next to the schoolhouse. There was Captain Gary Prado was waiting there, Major Ayoro, the executive of the battalion, all the high operation people from the operation itself in there. We went to the room where Che was. So we went through this door. It was a little window on the left side, and he was in the ground. He was tied down, his hands and legs. And in front of him was the dead body of a couple of Cubans. One was Captain Oslo Pantoja, who was in charge of training for falling guerrillas in Cuba, and another Cuban captain who had died in combat. Whenever Centeno started asking questions, Che, of interest to us, he looked at him and he would not answer anything. To the point that he said, look, you are a foreigner, you are invaded my country, the least you should have the courtesy of answering me. Che didn't say a word. So we all went out of the room. I asked the colonel if I could get the documentation from the colonel to be able to photograph it from my government. So he ordered the colonel to give me all of this. He had a bag that was like this around. It was camel color, very thick. And inside it had a German book, who was a diary. Of course, it was written in Spanish. It has some code book, very small code book, numerical code book with glue around them, the same thing that we use for one-way pad, we call, that was given to him by Red China. He will be able to receive message from Cuba, but he will not be able to transmit any. They had a booklet that was typewritten with message from Cuba signed by Ariel. And at that point, we believe Ariel was Fidel. Nevertheless, when I met Benigno, who defected eventually from Cuba, he was one of the 3 survivors from the guerrilla. He told me that it was not Fidel. It was Juan Carretero, who was the officer in charge of intelligence for the operation Che operation out of Cuba. So we had all of this documentation. He got some photograph from his family. He had some medicine for his asthma. So I took all of this and I started photographing the diary, which I had a Pentax camera and a Minox camera with me. So I photographing the whole thing. At one point in time, I came back by myself. So I stood in front of him and said, Che, I'd like to talk to you. He looked to me very arrogant and said, nobody talks to me, nobody interrogates me. So looking at that attitude, I said, Commander, I didn't come here to interrogate you. I admire you. You used to be head of a state in Cuba. You're like this because you believe in your ideals, even though I know they are mistaken. I came here to talk to you. So he looked at me for a few seconds to see if I was laughing. When he saw that I was serious, he said, can you untie me? Can I sit? So I ordered a soldier from the outside to come in and to untie Commander Guevara. We treat each other always with respect. So the guy came, we untied him, we sat him on a little bench. But whenever I was asking him questions that was of tactical interest to us, he would smile and say, I cannot answer that. But nevertheless, we did talk about different things. For example, I was talking about the economy, Cuban economy. And he was telling me that the Cuban economy was such in a poor shape because of the American embargo. Which I told him, Commander, that's kind of ironic for you to say that because you were the president of the National Bank and in charge of Cuban industry, and you are not even an economist. He said, do you know how I became president of the National Bank? I said, I have no idea. I said, I was sitting one day next to Camilo, and I understood that Fidel was asking for a dedicated communist. I raised my hand. He was asking for a dedicated economist. So I thought that was, a way for him not to answer the question. But when I talked to Benigno in Paris many, many years later, he told me it was true. That he was there and he thought that Fidel was asking for a dedicated communist. And he rolled his hand. Several months later, they made him president of the National Bank, and he also became Minister of Industry for Cuba. So we went back and forth. There was a point in time in the middle of the conversation that he looked at me and said, you are not Bolivian. He said, who do you think I am? He said, well, you can be a Puerto Rican, you can be a Cuban. And by the question you have been asking me, you are working for the United States Intelligence Service. So at that point, I told him, yes, I am a Cuban, and I was a member of the infiltration team of the Brigade 2506. And that caught his attention. He said, what's your name? And the reason was that we had a member of the infiltration team called Benigno Perez, who was a lieutenant in the Castro's army, and he happens to be working for him. He was an infiltrator with us. So when he landed with his team was immediately captured. And we saw people going to the different prisons to see if he could identify us from the infiltration team that we might have been in prison. Because he knew our true names and our faces, but we were all going in aliases. So he knew my name for sure from him. So not knowing exactly what was going to happen, I said Felix, and Felix didn't mean anything to him. We also asked about why he requested, what was that much interest in Bolivia? Why did he select Bolivia? He said, well, first of all, Bolivia is a very poor country. In his mind, the imperialistic United States will not be interested in spending that much effort in a country which is so poorly economically. If it was Venezuela, it would be something else. Second, they knew that the Bolivian armed forces were very poorly trained, and that was true on that behalf. And third, he said he had boundary with 5 different countries. If he would take Bolivia, it would be easier to support the revolution border to border with Brazil, with Chile, with Paraguay, Argentina, and Peru. That was one of the main reasons. I tried to ask him about Africa. He didn't want to talk about Africa. I said, okay, you don't want to talk about Africa, but your own people have told us that you had like 10,000 guerrillas, and they were very poor soldiers. So he said, well, if I had 10,000 guerrillas, it would have been different. But you're right. They're very poor soldiers. So we went back and forth, in and out of the room. Then it was a phone call that arrived in the area. At that time, they had a landline that was going to Valle Grande, and they asked for the highest ranking officer. I had the rank of captain. There were only 2 lieutenants from the Bolivian army there, so they called me. And it was from the High Bolivian Command out of Santa Cruz, and the order was 500, 600. 500 was, it's a simple code was Che, 600 kill him, 700 keep him alive. So I went back to the phone and said, look, can you repeat? They confirmed definitely 500, 600. So when Colonel Centeno came back before he left in the helicopter, I called him aside and said, "Mi Colonel, this order from your High Bolivian Command to eliminate the prisoner. As you know, we have specific instruction to try to save, to keep him alive, and we have helicopter and plane to get him to Panama for interrogation." So he looked at me and said, "Felix, we are very grateful for your help, but this is order from my president, my commander-in-chief. If I don't do that, I will be fired from the armed forces. The helicopter is going to go and come several times, bringing food and ammunition and taking our wounded and our dead. It's going to come back at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I want your word of honor that you will bring me back the dead body of Che. And you can justiciate him any way you want, because we know how much harm he has done to your country." I said, "Mi Colonel, try to change their minds, very important, but if it's not changed in order, I give you my word of honor that I will bring you back the dead body of Che." We embraced and he left. And sure enough, the helicopter came several times. One of that's when the pilot came with the pilot Major Jaime Niño de Guzmán came with camera from the Major Saucedo. He said, "Mi Capitan, the Major wanted a picture with the prisoner." So I looked at him and said, "Commander, do you mind?" He said, "No." So we took him around. I remember that I gave my camera to the Major. He was the one who took the picture of Che myself. I put my hand around him and said, "Commander, look at the little bird." And he was laughing. So actually, when I sent that film to the agents, I said, "There is a picture of Che and myself laughing." Of course, he changed the expression when he knew that the shutter was ready to be shot, the picture. And then we started waiting and see what happened after that. Then later on, about 12:30 in the afternoon, here comes this lady with a little radio. She said, mi Capitan, when are you going to kill him?" I said, "Why do you say that?" I said, "We saw you being photographed with him not too long ago out there. And look, the radio is already giving the news that he died in combat wounds." So at that point in time, I thought there was no reason to wait any longer. So I went into the room, I stood in front of him, I looked at him and said, "Commander, I'm sorry. I tried my best. This is order from the High Bolivian Command." He perfectly understood what I was saying. He turned white like a piece of paper, but he said, "It's better this way. I should have never been captured alive." Then he pulled the pipe that he had here. Let's say, "I'd like to give this pipe to a soldadito who treated me with respect." And at that point, Sergeant Terán burst into the room. "Yo quiero la pipa, mi capitán, I want the pipe." And she dijo, "No, a ti no te la doy." Put the pipe back. So I ordered him 3 times to leave the room. He did. I said, "Commander, will you give it to me?" He thought for a few seconds. He said, "Sí, a ti sí te la doy. I will give it to you." So I got the pipe, put it here. He said, "If I can, do you want anything for your family?" Then I will say in a sarcastic way, he said, "Well, if you can tell Fidel that he will soon see a triumphant revolution in America." Like saying, maybe you double-cross me, but this is going to be successful no matter what. And then he changed the expression and he said, "And you can tell my wife to remarry and try to be happy." He was the last word. We shook hands and we embraced. And let me tell you, that was one of the hardest things in my career, because we don't order the assassination of anybody, no matter who it is, when it's captured. Nevertheless, I thought what happened when Batista released Fidel Castro, what happened to my country. Because at one time I thought maybe I could cut the landline and tell the pilot when he arrived that we finally got our government to convince his government to release Che and alive, and then if we brought him, they could not do anything. At the same time, I thought that same thing, if Batista did that with Fidel, look what happened to Cuba. This is not my decision. This was the decision of the Bolivian. He invaded this country. I'm here to advise, not to command. And I let history found his way, the way that it happened. So I didn't do anything else for trying to save his life. Then I left the room. There was a sergeant at the right next to a Lieutenant Perez, and I told him, "Sergeant, don't shoot from here up. Shoot from here down, because this man's supposed to die from combat wounds." I said, "Sí, mi capitán, sí, mi capitán." It was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon when I left the room in there. I understand that Sergeant Teran borrowed an M2 carbine from Lieutenant Perez, and about 1:15 we heard the burst of fire, and that was the time that he was killed.
Just a couple of minutes left here in our conversation. Real quick, what comes to mind today when you see people in America with the Che Guevara T-shirts or other images and almost treating him like an icon?
Most of them are the ignorance of people doesn't know who he was. And all they buy it because they have no idea what they are buying. I recall I was in Paris one time. There was a Frenchman with a T-shirt like that, and Benigno, who was with me, asked his wife, asked him who he is, and the guy looked at the T-shirt and say, "That's a rock singer." So he saw this T-shirt in there. He really believed the guy was a rock singer and bought it. So a lot of them have no idea who it is, and they really don't know how cruel this guy was. I have different experience during my time. For example, there was a lady that I saw in a funeral home in Miami one time. She came to tell her story, say her son was 15-year-old, and he had been condemned to execution because writing things on the wall to do an example of people. And he asked to see Che Guevara, and she went to La Cabaña Fortress. When he received her, he had his legs on top of the bureau, and said, "Señora, ¿qué puedo hacer por usted? What can I do for you?" And he said, "Commander, my son is very young, he's 15 years old. Please save his life. I can guarantee he will not do it again." He asked for the name of the son. When was he going to be executed? It was a Monday. He was supposed to be executed on a Friday. So he ordered an assistant to bring it over. And when the guy arrived, he told the guy, "Look, execute her son now. She doesn't have to wait until Friday." She said that she fainted. And there was another one that I just learned about 3 months ago from a lady who went to visit his father, who was in prison, eventually executed, and said she was on a line to visit his father, with along many other Cubans. They arrived very early. The meeting was supposed to be about 11 o'clock in the morning, and Che Guevara arrived. So these ladies start calling, Che, until finally Che came, "What can I do for you?" And she said, "Look, Commander, my son, he's very young. He haven't done really anything. I have 3 weeks that I don't sleep. Please save his life." So same thing. He asked for the name of his son. Then he asked an assistant to bring her son here. When the son arrived, he went and said, "You son of a bitch, get down there on the floor. Your mother haven't been sleeping for 3 weeks because of you." And when he did that, he shot him on the head. And then everybody started, crying, "Asesino," and they stopped all the visits that day. That was the Che Guevara that people doesn't know.
Let's talk a little bit about your time in Vietnam. You were the head of a provincial reconnaissance unit. You also took part in helicopter missions. Tell us a little bit about that, and also especially about the day you were shot down.
When I got to Vietnam with the PRU, we had two responsibilities that they entrusted to me. One was to stop the rocketing of Saigon, and the other one was to stop the rocketing of the boat going to Saigon. We had the responsibility of 11 units that were 11 provinces around the Saigon area, called Sub-Region 3. And we, at the time, we had the Special Forces and SEALs working for us, one in every one of those units. As time went by, because of Vietnamization program, they all faces away, and we had the responsibility to deal directly with all of those units. So I started working with the Vietnamese. We had a great relationship. We were able to stop the rocketing on Saigon. We were able to capture a guy by the name of Quang, who was a young North Vietnamese soldier. He used to be a paramedic in Ha Bac, which is a province around Hanoi. And he was very unhappy with them because he was the only male in the family. And normally when they brought people from the north, there are always big families. They always left one male to take care of the mother. And he was the only male and were taken along. So he was very cooperative. He was the one who told us the area where these people were hiding from Sub-Region 4 who do the rocketing of Saigon. And we never looked in that area. Why? Because there was a high tide that looks like 14 feet, and nobody will survive or live in there. Then this guy who told us what they were doing, they have 55-gallon drums, soldered one on top of the other. So when the water come up, they will stay on top of the tank. When the water went down, they got the 122 Soviet rocket, went across the river, they fired the rocket into the Saigon area, trying to aim to the American embassy and to the presidential palace, but they never hit. But it was a political scene to be able to say that with 500,000 troops in country, the United States could not stop the rocketing of Saigon. So with this information, we started looking in that area for this group, and it was very easy to then detect them because they had just come out from there. It was fresh prints because of the the water and in the ground, and we started eliminating a lot of things. And the big operation took place on the 4th of December of 1970 against Tutan, the commander of the unit. During that day, they were near a river, and we went there in the daytime. We had a big firefight. They we thought there were several PRU very badly wounded. So I landed with a Slick, a helicopter from the 222nd Assault Helicopter Battalion called the Greyhound. And the pilot was a warrant officer, Bomberger, Bruce Bomberger. And that guy was fantastic. We landed there, it was firefight all over the place, shooting everywhere. So I went down with another 2 Vietnamese. We picked up the bodies, and they were dead. We thought they were wounded, but they were dead. We put it on the helicopter, and we brought it to 24th Evac, and they already had died. I put this one warrant officer, Bomberger, and he received the Bronze Star for that operation in there. So from that point on, we continued the pressure, and they could not fire a single rocket against into Saigon until after I left in 1972. Now, about the boat, they had always, when the boat came into the river, they were escorted by the gunships called the Seawolf from the Navy. And, every time they saw a flash when the rocket hit the boat, they shoot the hell out of that area, and they couldn't get anybody. Now, we were able to pick up one unit called a sapper unit, and then we found out that in his backpack of this guy, they had a big electrical wire, was green, about 60 meters long. So we learned then from the guy what they were doing was they would set up the rocket in a platform pointing toward the boat. They got a point of reference 60 meters away, and whenever the boat hit that point of reference, they electrically activate the rocket. It will hit the boat, then this gunship will hit the point of explosion. There was nobody there. So I took the Navy to fly over, and I got 3 PRUs in the ground, put one with a red smoke grenade in the middle, and then the yellow smoke grenade 60 meters on both sides. So they can see physically, the distance more or less from the explosion. So from there on, every time they saw an explosion in the middle, they would shoot on both sides. We were able to build six teams that had no idea. They had no idea what was going on, and we stopped the rocketing of the boat going into Saigon. And that's how I got the Vietnamese Naval Medal of Honor from the commander of the Vietnamese Navy.
It's been an incredible career, Mr. Rodriguez. We also know that you received the Intelligence Star for Valor, which is, I believe, the highest award that you can get.
One of the highest.
One of the highest you can get in the intelligence community. Your assistance with the Nicaraguan Contras, and there's so much to your story, and I wish we had time to get to all of it, sir. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your service to our country.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Felix Rodriguez, U.S. Army veteran, served in the Vietnam War, also with the CIA, and of course, as you just heard, instrumental in the capture of Cuban revolutionary Che Guevara. I'm Greg Corombos. This is Veterans Chronicles.